To begin with the war in Ukraine, breaking overnight, more civilian casualties from heavy shelling by the Russians in key cities. Ukrainian officials say at least one person was killed and several others injured after a missile hit a multi-story apartment building yesterday in the outskirts of Kyiv. And in besieged Mariupol, officials say Russian forces bombed a theater there that was sheltering more than 1,000 people. The death toll is still unknown. But this morning, according to a post on Facebook by a Ukrainian official, some people are emerging from the rubble alive. It appears Russia's military progress has been stalled. UK defense officials saying Russian forces are suffering heavy losses from Ukrainian resistance.
All this as a war of words unfolds. President Biden calling Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal for the first time as he comments and it commits another $800 million in military support for Ukraine.
I want to be honest with you. This could be a long and difficult battle. But the American people will be steadfast in our support of the people of Ukraine.
And this morning, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy now pleading with Germany's parliament for help, one day after an impassioned address to Congress. Zelenskyy addressing fears of another world war with our own Lester Holt.
Do you agree that it wouldn't take much to end up in World War III?
Well, nobody knows whether it may have already started.
NBC News correspondent Molly Hunter begins our coverage this morning from Lviv. Good morning, Molly. President Zelenskyy addressed Germany's parliament earlier today, one day after speaking to our Congress. He appeared to be a little critical of Germany in his remarks. Tell us more about that speech.
Yeah, not just a little critical. It was scathing, and he still got a standing ovation. So as you say, this is one day after, of course, he addressed the Congress, where he also got a standing ovation. But he basically blasted Germany for being complicit in Russia's war through their Russian business ties, through their indecision, through their lack of leadership. He said, "We saw how many connections your companies still maintain with Russia, your country, and some other countries as well. We are asking you to act as the aggressor, seize you as a power, and not that you're just thinking about the economy, the economy, the economy." And he addressed German Chancellor Scholz directly to say, give Germany the leader that they deserve.
Molly, Mariupol has been one of the worst hit cities in this conflict. Ukrainian officials have accused Russia of bombing a theater and a swimming pool that was sheltering civilians. Russia has denied carrying out that attack. What can you tell us about this incident, and how are the humanitarian efforts going in that city?
Yeah, this was the big headline overnight. So it was a drama theater, and apparently it was in the heart of what was once a very vibrant section of Mariupol. That is that southeast city on the Black Sea that we have been talking about for the last 2 weeks that has been besieged by the Russians, 450,000 people basically being starved out. Well, this theater was a refuge for civilians. But next to this theater, we see in pictures, satellite images by Maxar, they had written kids in white writing in the Russian language, so that from the air you can quite easily see that kids are staying there. Now, our understanding is that 1,200 people were sleeping there. We are hearing reports, as you mentioned in the open, about possibly survivors, but we don't have any kind of death toll or real numbers yet to share.
That is so heartbreaking. Molly, we are also hearing that one person has died in the capital, Kyiv, after the remains of a downed missile hit a residential building there. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, and this has been happening for the last several nights, as our Richard Engel has been reporting in the capital of Kyiv. Now, according to the Ukrainian military, they have stalled Russian ground forces, so tanks and ground troops outside some of these cities that they have attacked heavily and besieged, like Mariupol, like Volnovakha, like Kharkiv, and like the capital city. What's happening now, because those troops have stalled, is they are firing rockets, they are firing attacks, they are firing missiles into the center of these cities indiscriminately, hitting civilian targets like apartment buildings, like metro stops, like a railway station. In Zaporizhia yesterday, they hit a botanical garden, things with no military infrastructure in any way around. These could not be confused for military targets. The Russians are now sending indiscriminate attacks into city centers, civilian centers, and the civilian death toll because of that is going up inside Kyiv.
Molly, these are some of the terrible war crimes that Russia is being accused of. Thank you so much for your reporting. We'll catch up with you a little later in the show.
After his emotional message to Congress yesterday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke with our own Lester Holt to discuss the state of his country as the Russian invasion continues. Here's Lester with more.
I spoke to Ukraine's President Zelenskyy in an NBC News exclusive interview with the help of a Ukrainian government-provided translator. I'd like to begin by asking you the status of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. There's been some reporting that the framework of a deal is being hammered out, one in which you would renounce NATO ambitions, declare neutrality, not allow foreign militaries to base on your land. Can you confirm any of that and update us on the status of negotiations?
Well, thank you for this question, Lester. First of all, the negotiations are still in progress. The negotiations are fairly difficult. And the current conditions of negotiation, I would say, it continues. Any war could be finished at the table of negotiations.
You delivered a very passionate speech to Congress. You once again renewed your call for a no-fly zone. As you know, that's a non-starter in this country. But you also made the pitch for an alternative, and that's the fighter planes. Do you think that President Biden is inching closer to perhaps reconsidering transferring fighter planes to Ukraine?
Well, this is the choice for the President Biden to take, and the whole civilized world would need to take. And hopefully, that choice would coincide with the choice of the Ukrainian people, because currently Russia has an advantage in the air. Our partners can support us from the standpoint of supporting and supplying of those aircraft.
President Biden has been very clear. He's worried about provocations that could trigger World War III. Do you understand his concern there, and do you agree that it wouldn't take much to end up in World War III?
Well, nobody knows whether it may have already started, and what is the possibility of this war if Ukraine will fall, in case Ukraine will fall. It's very hard to say, and we've seen this 80 years ago when the Second World War has started, and there were similar tragedies in the history. Nobody would be able to predict when the full-scale war would start and how it will end and who will put an end to that. In any case, the wars tend to end up in millions of people lost. People die, and millions of buildings destroyed. Now we have different technologies, nuclear weapons. In this case, we have the whole civilization at stake.
The U.S. administration has raised concerns that Russia might launch a chemical attack. Do you think there is a red line, and whether that would be a red line that the U.S. would move forward and become more actively involved in combat?
I believe that Russians have already crossed all the red lines when they started shelling civilians. They've killed over 100 of children. And I don't understand the meaning of red lines. What else should we wait for? For letting Russians kill 200, 300, or 400 children?
And then I asked him about the fate of Ukraine's capital, the city where he still is tonight, with the Russian onslaught intensifying.
If Kyiv falls to the Russians, does the entire country of Ukraine fall to the Russians?
Well, our people are unconquerable. And this is what our people have clearly demonstrated. You can conquer the city, you can break the heart, but you won't be able to force anyone to love someone. That is why the heart will always remain with the Ukrainians.
President Zelenskyy hosted 3 European leaders earlier this week. I asked him whether he has invited President Biden. He replied he would be happy to do so.
Lester Holt, thank you so much again, interviewing him right after addressing Congress. Pretty amazing.
Powerful remarks. Well, let's dig a little deeper into the situation in Ukraine with Joe Cirincione. He's a nuclear expert and a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Joe, good morning. You said in a recent interview that we are closer to the risk of nuclear use than at any time since the 1980s. Yesterday, President Biden called Putin, quote, a war criminal, which then Moscow called unacceptable and unforgivable. My question is, at this point, is it wise to use rhetoric like that? Or does the world need to call a spade and take action to stop Putin? I've read that, sometimes with a bully, you have to speak bully. Use language Putin understands. What do you think, Joe?
I think President Biden is speaking the simple truth. It's been obvious to most of us since the beginning of this war that Putin is engaged in multiple war crimes. Remember, it's against the law of war, the so-called Geneva Conventions, to shell civilians indiscriminately, to target civilian infrastructure, to attack nuclear power plants. There's a whole separate law against attacking civilian nuclear power plants. These are war crimes, and Putin is the one directing this war. I think Biden's accurate and is correct to be calling him out at this point. I hope the U.S. will go further and actually bring war crime charges against Putin during the war before the International Criminal Court.
Such an important distinction there. There really is a difference just between these things that we're seeing that look awful and an actual war crime. Now, Joe, that, of course, was this escalation of rhetoric from Washington, but we are also seeing this new supply of military aid. But Russia previously warned the U.S. that it's acting dangerously by supplying weapons to Ukraine. And I think a lot of people are confused about what these lines are. I think it's pretty clear how a no-fly zone, the enforcement of that, puts American and NATO forces head-to-head with Russian forces, so that makes sense. But this line about weapons or this line about jets seems blurrier. Are you concerned that this $800 million package raises the risk of U.S. being dragged into a conflict with Russia? Or do you think a concern like that even is just essentially allowing Putin to make the rules?
Well, the rules actually are just prescribed in international law. If you are aiding one side in a war, technically you're a co-belligerent. That is, you're involved in the war effort. And the distinction that's being made is not really a legal one, but a military one. Most experts would draw the line at heavy equipment, heavy weaponry, like jet fighters, like tanks, like armored vehicles. The kind of aid we've been giving them, however, is actually more effective. It's more the things that they need. This is very sophisticated equipment. These javelins, these stingers, these other anti-armor weapons, these new switchblade drones, so-called kamikaze drones that are in this $800 million package are extremely effective. I just heard a Ukrainian lawmaker on your network yesterday talking about her friend, her teacher, was teaching school 3 weeks ago, is now carrying a Javelin anti-tank missile. They're sophisticated, but part of that sophistication is that they're very easy to use. Think of them like your iPhone, a very sophisticated piece of machinery, but very simple to operate and deadly to Ukrainian forces. I think these weapons, plus the tenacity and morale of the Ukrainian forces, are why you see the Russian offensive stalled and why you see Ukrainian forces now going on the counteroffensive. They're able, with small bands of Ukrainian fighters, to go in and completely disrupt these armored columns.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Joe, thank you so much. Really great analysis there. We so appreciate it, as always. Now, Ukrainian President Zelensky's speech to Congress has helped boost U.S. support for Ukraine. Just after he spoke, President Biden was quick to commit to new military aid to Ukraine, as we were just discussing. The president announced an additional $800 million in military support and also called Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal.
The American people will be steadfast in our support of the people of Ukraine in the face of Putin's immoral, unethical attacks on civilian populations. We are united in our abhorrence of Putin's depraved onslaught, and we're going to continue to have their backs as they fight for their freedom, their democracy, their very survival.
Let's go now to NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander in Washington. Peter, good morning. So, of course, let's start with that comment from President Biden. We know the U.S. is investigating possible war crimes in Ukraine. Did the White House elaborate on the president calling Putin a war criminal. I mean, that is, as a lot of us have become more comfortable understanding at this point, a very important distinction than just feeling that what's happening in Ukraine is this terrible thing, a war criminal. What kind of comments, what kind of weight do those comments carry?
Well, this was clearly the harshest condemnation by President Biden himself of Vladimir Putin since this now 3+ week old war began. The White House to this point has steered clear of using that phrase war criminal. They note that there was an ongoing international and U.S. Investigation into war crimes that Putin is accused of. But the White House said yesterday the president, in effect, was speaking his opinion, that that's what he believes. They say those investigations are continuing. Nonetheless, Russia is pushing back on it. We heard from Dmitry Peskov. Notably, he is the press secretary, the spokesperson for Putin, describing President Biden's comments as unacceptable and unforgivable, and then following up and saying that those comments are not admissible in court. This is one of those situations that it's going to take a while to fully investigate, but it's clear based on what the world is watching from independent journalists on the ground right now and all the video that's been provided from there that civilians by heavy numbers have been the worst victims and often targeted, it appears, in the course of this war.
Yeah, absolutely, especially as we wait to hear the death toll from that strike in Mariupol recently. Now, Peter, the added assistance to Ukraine brings the total amount of aid to Ukraine authorized by the president to $2 billion now at this point, but the White House is still under pressure to do more. What else is in the works to aid Ukraine or punish Russia?
Well, let's start with what the White House just announced. Of course, this was the president's response to Zelenskyy's powerful remarks. The president said that Zelenskyy's speech was passionate, it was convincing, and then he detailed that $800 million of aid. It includes like 20 million rounds of ammunition, anti-aircraft equipment, anti-armor, anti-tank weapons as well, to say nothing of these deadly drones that the U.S. will now be providing, what are referred to as switchblades. They can effectively target Russian military positions and individuals from long distances away. And the U.S. is going to try to, the president says, acquire some longer-range mobile missile anti-aircraft systems as well to target those planes and helicopters and the cruise missiles that Russia has been using. So that's what the U.S. is doing so far. $1 billion announced and given over just the course of the last week. The U.S. by far the biggest contributor of military aid to Ukraine. But the president notably did not make any mention of a no-fly zone. He didn't talk about the transfer, helping transfer those Polish fighter jets, Soviet-era MiG fighter jets to Ukraine that many lawmakers, mostly Republicans, have been demanding. The president, Savannah, as you know well, has warned that that would effectively spark World War III.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of back and forth, a lot of conversation and questions about that one. Peter Alexander, thank you so much.
Russia's attack on Ukraine has forced more than 3 million people to flee the country in just 3 weeks. More than 1.9 million Ukrainians have entered into Poland alone. That is higher than the entire population of Warsaw. That's the largest city in Poland. NBC News senior national correspondent Jay Gray joins us now from a town in Poland near the border of Ukraine. Good morning to you, Jay. We know Poland has opened its doors to the majority of Ukrainian refugees since this war began. How is the country doing in terms of handling this influx? And also talk to us about what the humanitarian workers there are doing to help.
Yeah, Vicki, it's overwhelming for Poland. They've about reached their limit as far as those that can stay here permanently. And so other countries are taking part of that burden because we know a lot more refugees are on the way. You asked about the humanitarian effort. There's not one that's much better than this. I'm standing in what used to be an empty warehouse, an abandoned warehouse. No power, no water. It has been transformed by the World Central Kitchen into a world-class kitchen. Chefs from around the country coming in and doing what they can to provide help, provide food, nourishment for those who are making that journey. And it's unbelievable just to see the process that they've created here. They are cooking hot meals every day around the clock for all of these refugees. They have the ability in this warehouse alone to make 200,000 meals a day or more, and you can see what they're using to cook here. I mean, it's amazing to see just these huge pots that continue to churn out soup, continue to churn out chicken, pork, beef, things that, you know, we don't think about a lot, but those who have walked maybe 2-3 days to get to the border with their children, they can't wait to have a hot meal. And so they get the process done here, they get the cooking done here, and then everything's loaded up into vans, into trucks. We've seen 18-wheelers here loading up food. They take this food to all of the border crossings, to every border crossing here, and some across the border as well. So they're really doing what no one else can. They're doing what they do best, providing food for those who have made this journey. And it's been amazing to see such a great and volunteer effort. Chefs from around the world, people from around the world just gathering to try and help out those that are making that trip.
The civilian volunteers, the professional chefs, everybody getting together. Thank you for that tour. It's really remarkable how organized it is and how quickly they were able to set up. Jay, earlier this week, the U.S. authorized $186 million in additional humanitarian aid for Ukraine and surrounding countries. Talk to us about where this aid money goes and how the U.S. and other countries can help with this situation. Certainly food, water, shelter, all priorities.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of this money is going, to organizations that are on the ground here, so they can disperse what they know that the refugees need here. So a lot of that money goes to organizations that are buying clothes, blankets, toiletries for those that are coming across the border. Food is another issue, as you talk about, and just simple things like water, bread, and things like that. And so it's going into that. You'll see a lot of it also going into these programs to help people once they're established and starting to, in essence, start a new life, Vicki. And so it'll be put into getting children school supplies. It'll be put into helping job train some of these women who have come over and left their loved ones behind to fight. And so we're seeing that start to progress now. In fact, Poland yesterday began issuing ID cards to those who are staying for extended time in Poland. It'll give them a chance to register their kids for school, to get health insurance through the government here, to get a job. It'll make it easier to get a job. And so we're seeing that process start to unfold, and that's where a lot of that funding goes.
So many logistical needs as well, and hopefully getting those kids back in school, some normalcy for them. Jay Gray, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.